Hell's Angels is easily one of the most legendarily reckless and dangerous productions in the entire history of Hollywood. A film whose making killed multiple men, fractured its young director's skull, and burned through the kind of money that bankrupted lesser fortunes. So, let's take a look behind the scenes of the movie with 15 dark things you didn't know about Hell's Angels, including the 18-year-old unknown who replaced a Norwegian silent star because of one fatal accent. The future director of Frankenstein who quietly made his entire feature debut hiding inside this production, and the famous stunt pilot who flatly refused to fly a shot that Howard Hughes then climbed into the cockpit and attempted himself and very nearly died doing. Now, to understand Hell's Angels, you first have to understand the staggering hubris of the young man who made it. Howard Hughes was 21 years old when principal photography began in October of 1927. He was the heir to the Hughes tool company drill bit fortune, which had made him spectacularly wealthy from the moment his father died in 1924. He had already produced 2 films, Everybody's Acting and 2 Arabian Nights, both of which had been successful enough to convince him that Hollywood was a place he could conquer with money alone. And he had a target. William Wellman's Wings had just won the very first Academy Award for Best Picture. It was a definitive aerial combat film, the gold standard of the form. Hughes did not want to make a film as good as Wings. He wanted to make a film that would make Wings look like a children's matinee. He had just earned his own pilot's license. He had access to roughly $4 million in liquid capital, and he had absolutely no understanding of the limits of what could be photographed safely. The result, predictably, was catastrophe, sustained, expensive, sometimes lethal catastrophe. But it was also, in the end, something approaching genuine cinema history. So, Hughes started shooting in late October of 1927, and almost immediately the entire ground beneath the project shifted. Because just weeks before principal photography began, Warner Brothers had premiered The Jazz Singer, the first sound feature, the film that ended the silent era overnight. By the time Hughes had a year and a half of footage in the can, audiences had completely abandoned silent cinema. Theaters that did not have sound equipment were closing. Films released without dialogue were dying at the box office. And Hughes was sitting on approximately 2 million feet of beautifully shot, technically accomplished, completely silent material. The decision he made next was the most expensive choice in the production. He did not abandon the film. He did not release the silent version while he still could. Instead, he decided to keep the aerial footage, which worked perfectly well without dialogue, and reshoot every single dramatic scene with sound. This effectively meant making the film twice with 2 different leading ladies, 2 production phases, and 2 separate creative teams working on what would eventually be sold as a single coherent picture. Now, the directing credit on Hell's Angels reads Howard Hughes, but the actual production was a revolving door of filmmakers who tried and failed to work with him. Marshall Nealon, the original director, started principal photography in October of 1927 and reportedly quit within weeks, unable to tolerate Hughes' constant interference and unwillingness to defer to professional craft. Luther Reed was brought in next on loan from Paramount and lasted only marginally longer. Edmund Goulding is said to have directed significant portions of the ground sequences in the silent phase. Howard Hawks himself was reportedly approached and may have done uncredited work. By the time the sound era arrived and the film needed to be completely overhauled, Hughes had burned through his 4th or 5th director and decided he would simply take the credit himself. The historical consensus, reported repeatedly in production histories, is that Hughes physically directed most of the aerial sequences, but relied heavily on others for nearly everything that happened on the ground. The single credit on the final film conceals a production team of remarkable size, talent, and exhaustion. Hell's Angels was widely reported in 1930 as the most expensive motion picture ever produced, a $4 million epic that dwarfed every previous Hollywood spectacle. That figure was repeated in every major newspaper. It was emblazoned on the film's posters. It became, almost immediately, the central piece of the film's mythology. However, it was not entirely true. Production accounts later examined by film historians indicate that the actual cost of Hell's Angels was approximately $2.8 million. Still an enormous figure for 1930, but considerably less than the $4 million Ben-Hur of 1925, and roughly 30% less than what Hughes was claiming in the press. The inflated figure was, in effect, the world's first modern movie publicity stunt. Hughes understood instinctively that audiences would pay to see a film advertised as the most expensive ever made, that the cost itself was the spectacle. He padded the number. He fed the number to friendly columnists. He let the number do the marketing work for him. the fact that it took historians the better part of 7 decades to definitively unwind. The lie is testimony to how thoroughly he sold it. So when the decision came to reshoot the dramatic scenes with sound, Hughes had to confront a problem that the entire industry was wrestling with that year. What to do with silent era stars whose voices did not match their faces? His leading lady was Greta Nielsen, a Norwegian silent film actress who had been cast as Helen, a posh British aristocrat. Nielsen's accent was thick, unmistakable, and entirely incompatible with the character she was meant to be playing. Hughes paid her in full, terminated her contract, and began the search for a replacement. Nielsen's career never genuinely recovered. She continued working in films for several more years, but she never approached the level of fame she had been on the verge of in 1927. She has become, in the historical record, one of the first and most defining casualties of the sound revolution, a star whose career was ended not by lack of talent, not by scandal, not by the studio system turning against her, but by the simple accident of being born in the wrong country at the wrong moment in cinema's technological transition. Now, the replacement for Nielsen was, by every reasonable Hollywood standard of the time, completely unqualified. Jean Harlow was 18 years old. She had no significant credits. She had been working as an extra and bit player. She was introduced to Hughes through her co-star Ben Lyon, who had spotted her and brought her to the attention of assistant director David Marks. Hughes met her, looked at her on screen for approximately 5 minutes, and signed her to a long-term personal contract. The decision was not based on her acting ability. Multiple production accounts confirmed that her dramatic skills were limited at the time of casting, a deficiency that James Whale spent considerable energy trying to address during shooting. The decision was based on her face, her platinum hair, her capacity to be photographed, and Hughes' instinct that audiences would respond to her. He was right. Hell's Angels turned Harlow into one of the most recognized faces in the world overnight. However, Hughes himself appeared to lose interest in her almost immediately after the film opened. He ignored her career, declined to develop further vehicles for her, and eventually sold her contract to MGM, where she would become the defining sex symbol of the decade before her death at 26. So Hughes needed someone who could actually direct dialogue scenes, given that he had no experience doing it himself and his leading lady had no experience performing them. He hired a British theater director named James Whale, who had recently arrived in Hollywood and was looking for film work. Whale's contribution to Hell's Angels was credited as dialogue director, a minor, almost technical sounding credit. The reality, according to multiple production histories, was that Whale directed substantial portions of the entire sound version of the film, particularly every scene involving Jean Harlow. He coached her line by line. He blocked her scenes. He effectively functioned as the picture's primary dramatic director for months. This was, in effect, James Whale's feature film debut, and the man who learned his craft on this notoriously chaotic production would, within 12 months of its release, direct Frankenstein for Universal. Within a few more years, he would direct The Old Dark House, The Invisible Man, and Bride of Frankenstein, and become one of the most important horror directors in cinema history. Hell's Angels gave him almost no credit. It also gave him his entire career. Now, somewhere inside the film's 2-hour and 7-minute runtime, Jean Harlow delivers what is arguably the single most quoted line in early sound cinema. Wearing a gown that the censors of the era found genuinely scandalous, she turns to Ben Lyon and asks, "Would you be shocked if I put on something more comfortable?" The line became, almost immediately, one of the defining moments of pre-code Hollywood, the precise instant when American cinema announced what it was going to be allowed to say now that the cameras could record sound. And Jean Harlow, the woman who delivered it, hated the line. Multiple sources record her describing it as one of the corniest pieces of dialogue ever written. She thought it was lazy. She thought it was beneath her even at the start of her career. She was reportedly embarrassed by her own delivery of it. None of that mattered. The line went into the cultural bloodstream and never came out. It has been quoted, parodied, referenced, and rewritten for nearly a century, almost always without acknowledgement, that the woman who said it first considered it the worst sentence anyone had ever asked her to perform. But the costs of Hell's Angels were measured in more than dollars. 3 stunt pilots and 1 mechanic died during the production. The most documented of those deaths is that of Clement K. Phillips, who was killed in a plane crash near Hayward, California, while ferrying a British fighter aircraft to the Oakland filming location. He was not even on set at the moment of his death. He was simply moving the equipment. Other deaths occurred during stunt sequences themselves, with men flying into tension wires, losing control on landing and crashing in the kinds of accidents that the aviation industry of 1928 simply accepted as the cost of doing business. There were no certified stunt coordinators in any modern sense. There were no SAG safety officers. There were no FAA protocols governing the airspace over a film production. There was Howard Hughes telling experienced pilots what shot he needed, and there was the basic willingness of those pilots to take their chances at the rate of pay being offered. 4 men did not come back from that film. Their names are absent from most of the celebratory production histories. They should not be. Now, the most famous incident of physical recklessness on the entire production was authored by Hughes himself. Paul Mantz, who would go on to become one of the most legendary stunt pilots in Hollywood history, and who would eventually die during the filming of Flight of the Phoenix in 1965, was the principal stunt pilot on Hell's Angels. Mantz looked at one of the late aerial stunts Hughes was demanding for the final dogfight sequence and refused to fly it. He considered it too dangerous. His judgment carried weight. This was the most experienced aviator on the set. Hughes responded by climbing into the cockpit himself. He had been a licensed pilot for less than a year. He attempted the stunt. He got the shot. He also crashed the plane. He was pulled from the wreckage with a fractured skull and required facial surgery. Surgery that, according to some biographers, permanently altered the contours of his face. Mantz was right. Hughes survived only because of fortune. So in order to stage aerial combat sequences of the scale he envisioned, Hughes assembled what was effectively a small private air force. The production employed roughly 75 pilots. It used approximately 50 aircraft, nearly half of which were genuine surviving examples of First World War fighter planes that Hughes had personally hunted down and purchased from collectors, scrappers, and former military operators across multiple countries. He acquired Sopwith Camels, Fokkers, SE-5s, and a working German Gotha bomber. The scale of the operation rivaled the resources of small national air forces of the period. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum has noted that no civilian production before or since has assembled a private collection of operational period aircraft on this scale. The aerial sequences in the final film, when you watch them now, are not models. They are not composites. They are real First World War aircraft, flown by real pilots, photographed in flight by camera operators sitting in adjacent aircraft. That is the source of their kinetic, dangerous, viscerally physical quality. It is also the source of their cost in lives. But arguably, the most psychologically unsettling sequence in the entire film is not a dogfight at all. It is the Zeppelin bombing of London. In the sequence, a German airship comes under counterattack from Royal Flying Corps fighters and finds itself losing altitude. To lighten the load and escape, the Zeppelin's commander orders the crew to jump, not in parachutes, but to their deaths into the cloud cover beneath them. The film shows men climbing to the railings, hesitating, and then leaping into nothing. It is an act of cold mathematical sacrifice framed without sentimentality or rescue. The sequence remains genuinely disturbing nearly a century later precisely because it is presented without dramatic relief. These are not heroic deaths. They are calculated ones, ordered by a commander who values the airship's survival over the men inside it. The sequence climaxes with a British pilot whose guns have jammed, deliberately crashing his fighter directly into the Zeppelin, bringing it down in a column of flame partially rendered in early two-strip Technicolor. It is the kind of scene that the production code, when it began strict enforcement in 1934, would have made impossible to film. Hell's Angels caught the last possible moment of pre-code freedom and used it to depict something genuinely uncomfortable. Now, the scale of the perfectionism Hughes brought to the aerial sequences can be quantified. According to multiple production histories, and the figure is repeated in Turner Classic Movies' detailed accounting of the production, Hughes shot approximately 250 feet of film for every 1 foot that appears in the finished movie. That is a shooting ratio of 250 to 1. By comparison, modern major studio productions typically operate at ratios between 10 and 30 to 1. Hughes was throwing away nearly all of his footage. He had pilots fly the same sequences again and again and again. He had camera operators repeat takes that he later threw out completely. The waste of resources, manpower, aircraft hours, and human risk was staggering. It also explains, more than any other single factor, why the film's actual production costs reached the level it did. Hughes was not building a film. He was conducting a private aviation research program with cameras attached. The fact that some of that footage eventually became cinema is almost incidental to the obsession that produced it. However, by 1930, as Hell's Angels finally approached completion, Howard Hughes realized he had a problem. Warner Brothers and producer Daryl F. Zanuck were preparing their own First World War aviation epic, The Dawn Patrol, and it threatened to reach theaters first. Hughes's response was characteristic. He first attempted to lease every surviving First World War aircraft in North America in order to deny Zanuck access to the equipment he needed. When that strategy failed, Hughes filed a lawsuit brought through his Caddo Company and the Gainsborough Corporation, alleging that the screenplay of The Dawn Patrol plagiarized material from Hell's Angels. The lawsuit was designed not to win damages, but to bog the Warner production down in litigation long enough for Hell's Angels to reach cinemas first. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Warner Brothers responded by rushing The Dawn Patrol through post-production with renewed urgency, and Hughes' lawsuit was eventually defeated in late 1930. The Dawn Patrol arrived in theaters before some of Hell's Angels' wider release runs. Hughes had spent so much effort trying to crush the competition that he ended up advertising for it. So, the world premiere of Hell's Angels was held at Grauman's Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard on the night of May 27, 1930. It is, by some accountings, still the largest film premiere ever staged in the history of cinema. Hughes spared no expense. The street was illuminated by approximately 185 arc lights, rented at a cost of $14,000, a figure roughly equivalent to $250,000 today. An actual fighter squadron flew overhead in formation. Scalpers sold $11 tickets for $50. Reports from the night estimate that 50,000 spectators packed Hollywood Boulevard to watch celebrity guests arrive. Hughes' publicity team claimed 500,000, which is almost certainly an exaggeration, but the actual number was unprecedented for any single film opening. The Los Angeles Police Department, overwhelmed by the crowd surging around the limousines of arriving stars, formally requested backup from the California National Guard. The National Guard was deployed to a film premiere. Jean Harlow arrived in white. Cecil B. DeMille was photographed in attendance. Gloria Swanson, Loretta Young, and Jackie Coogan were all present. Some film historians have speculated that this premiere may have directly inspired the climactic crowd riot in Nathaniel West's 1939 novel The Day of the Locust, a portrait of Hollywood at its most feverishly excessive. Mordaunt Hall of the New York Times was not entirely persuaded by what he saw. Reviewing the film in 1930, Hall observed that the picture was absorbing and exciting in essentially every instance, but only when the producer forgot Helen, the flaxen-haired creature, and turned his cameras back to the war itself. Hall was unimpressed by the love triangle plot. He was unimpressed by what he and other contemporary critics described as the limited dramatic abilities of the young Jean Harlow. The contemporary critical consensus, broadly, was that the aerial sequences were astonishing and the rest of the film was forgettable. But nowadays, Hell's Angels is widely viewed as one of the foundational documents of aviation cinema, and the contempt for Jean Harlow has aged in ways that the critics of 1930 could not have anticipated. The Criterion Collection has restored the film. The Library of Congress preserves the original elements. The dogfight sequences are still studied as examples of practical aerial photography that has never been surpassed, even by digital recreations costing 100 times what Hughes spent. And Jean Harlow, dismissed at the time as a pretty face who could not act, is now understood as one of the most influential screen presences of her decade, a performer whose magnetism in front of the camera was something distinct from craft, and whose loss at the age of 26 remains one of the genuine tragedies of early sound cinema. The critics of 1930 wanted more dogfights and less Harlow. History has decided it wanted both. The film's reputation in 2025 rests on something the contemporary reviewers were not capable of seeing: the raw documentary value of what was actually being committed to celluloid. Those are not effects. Those are not stunts in the modern sense. Those are real First World War aircraft, flown to the genuine limits of their capacity, photographed by men sitting beside them in the air. It is a record of something that can never be made again, because the aircraft no longer exist, the pilots are no longer alive, and no insurance company on the planet would now permit it to be attempted. But let me know below, when it comes to aerial combat cinema, do you think anything has ever genuinely surpassed the practical, lethally real dogfights of Hell's Angels? Or has modern CGI finally caught up to what Howard Hughes was willing to die to capture in 1930?